Daniel Dillon, The Vanishing Heiress, written by Tane Blackadder, read by Arthur Howard. The city had settled into a somber, dripping rhythm, the earlier downpour softening into a gentle but persistent drizzle that seemed to weep from the leaden sky. Each drop traced a slow, meandering path down the grimy window of Mel's Griddle, smearing the vibrant neon signs from the bar across the street into bleeding, impressionistic smudges of color. Below, the pavement shimmered under the weak glow of the streetlights, its surface transformed into a dark, restless river that mirrored the unsettled mood within our booth. This weather, this quiet, soaking melancholy, felt appropriate, a natural extension of the quiet tension that had taken up residence with us. In our usual corner, a new kind of silence had settled, thick and heavy as the smell of old coffee and grease. It was a silence that now accommodated a third presence, changing its very chemistry. Sarah Sanderson occupied the space opposite Daniel, her posture not quite rigid, but still as if moving too suddenly might shatter the fragile piece she was carefully rebuilding. Her hands were cradled around a thick ceramic mug of tea, but the steam had long since ceased to rise. She hadn't taken a single sip. The warmth she sought seemed to be a purely tactile comfort, a small anchor to the present moment. She had been discharged from the discreet private clinic a week prior, her body healed from the immediate trauma of confinement and chemicals. But the evidence of a deeper, more profound convalescence was written in the faint, lavender shadows beneath her eyes, telling a story of sleepless nights and psychological wounds that were still knitting themselves together, slowly and painfully. Yet if you looked past the fatigue, if you met her gaze directly, you saw it. A newfound steeliness, a flinty resolve that had taken root in the scorched earth of her betrayal. The experience hadn't broken her. It had, in a horrifyingly literal sense, forged her. The woman who had trusted implicitly had been scoured away, and in her place was someone who understood the price of vulnerability and the necessity of strength. Her innocence had been a casualty, but in its absence a core of hardened, unyielding resolve had been exposed. She was here now, not as a client, not as a victim, but as an apprentice to grief, a student of the darkness that had touched her life. She observed everything, the way Daniel held his coffee, the way I organized my files, the unspoken shorthand that passed between us. She was learning the language of our world, a world she never wanted to be part of, but was now determined to understand. Her silence wasn't empty. It was observant, absorbing, and charged with a quiet determination to ensure her suffering would not be for nothing. The soft drumming of the rain against the window seemed to beat in time with this new solemn rhythm of our lives, a trio now bound by secrets and a shared, grim understanding of what lurked beneath the city's polished surface. The dynamic had shifted, irrevocably and completely. Sarah Sanderson was no longer a client, a case file to be closed and filed away. That chapter had ended the moment we walked her out of that sterile incinerator room. Now she occupied a new undefined space in our world, a space she was carving out for herself, with a quiet, formidable will. She was something else entirely. A consultant, perhaps, but that term felt too clinical, too cold for the raw reality of her presence. She was a living witness, a survivor who had not only stared into the abyss, but had felt its cold breath on her skin. She had seen the true face of the monster, not in a shadowy alley, but in the eyes of the man she loved across the breakfast table. And that intimate, horrific knowledge had ignited a fierce determination within her, not just to hide from the darkness, but to understand its mechanics, to learn how to fight it on its own terms. Daniel's offer of the booth seat had been a pivotal moment, a silent but profound invitation into the inner sanctum of our fractured partnership. It wasn't a chair. It was a place at the table. She had accepted without a word, a simple nod acknowledging the unspoken pact. And since that moment, I had become an unwilling spectator to a silent, powerful drama. I'd seen the way Daniel watched her when he believed my attention was elsewhere. The look in his eyes was unfamiliar. It was devoid of the hollowed-out grief that usually haunted him. Instead, it was replaced by a fierce, almost primal protective intensity. It was the look of a man who had once failed to save a world and now saw a second fragile chance to defend a single crucial part of it. He studied her not as a project, but as a person rediscovering her own strength, and in that journey, he seemed to be rediscovering a piece of his own. Conversely, I'd also caught the way Sarah's gaze would find him across the table. In her eyes there was a flicker of quiet awe, a profound respect that bordered on reverence. To her, he wasn't just an investigator, he was the unwavering anchor that had held fast in the tempest of her utter destruction. In her newly chaotic and terrifying world, where trust was ashes and every shadow held a memory of betrayal, Daniel Dillon was a fixed point, a man of action in a universe that had suddenly become unpredictable and cruel. The air between them now crackled with a new, unspoken energy, a magnetic tension so potent you could feel its hum vibrating beneath the diner's low chatter and the clatter of dishes. It was a current of shared understanding, of mirrored pain and of a reluctant, dawning attraction that neither dared to name or even fully acknowledge. They spoke in looks and silences, in the careful distance they maintained that somehow felt more intimate than any touch. They were like two celestial bodies, two planets that had survived catastrophic collisions, now locked in a silent gravitational orbit around each other. They were drawn together by the massive, invisible weight of their shared trauma, each recognizing in the other a reflection of their own resilience, a silent promise that in this broken world they wouldn't have to face the darkness alone. The familiar tinny chime of the bell above Mel's door sounded, but this time it did not introduce one of the usual weary regulars or late-night drifters. Instead, it heralded the arrival of a man who seemed like a ghost from a different century, a figure utterly divorced from the diner's world of cracked vinyl and grease-scented air. He was a walking testament to a world of old money, but that world was now visibly crumbling under the weight of a very new and very personal anguish. Elara Finch-Vaughn moved with a stiff, unnatural grace, as if every step pained him. He was tall and gaunt, his frame seeming to swim within the exquisite tailored lines of a Savile Row suit, a garment whose subtle, dark fabric and impeccable stitching undoubtedly commanded a price that eclipsed the value of my entire car. Yet, for all its perfection, the suit hung on him like a shroud. The aristocratic bearing, the effortless authority that must have been his birthright, was now fractured. It was being desperately held together by the sheer, fraying wire of his willpower, and what looked, to my trained eye, like a potent and dangerous cocktail of pharmaceutical anxiety and raw, untreated grief. He paused inside the doorway, his eyes a pale, troubled blue, scanning the room with a mixture of distaste and desperation before they settled on our booth. He approached, each step measured, and introduced himself. His voice was a strained, cultured baritone, its polished cadence cracked by a tremor of profound distress. He dispensed with any social pleasantries, any attempt to soften the blow. He got straight to the agonizing point that had brought him to this unlikely place. His daughter Elara was missing. He painted a portrait of her with broad, worried strokes. Elara Finch-Vaughn was 22, an art history student gliding through a prestigious university, her future seemingly guaranteed by a substantial trust fund and a famous name. But beneath the gilded surface, her father confessed, ran a deep and troubling current of rebellion that had recently curdled from typical youthful defiance into something far darker and more concerning. She had become involved with a new shadowy crowd, people he described with a shudder of genuine fear as individuals he wouldn't have in his home, a significant statement from a man whose world was built on networks and connections. Then, 2 days ago, she had vanished from her high-security apartment. The scene was meticulously clean. No signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no forced entry. The only things absent were Elara herself, her passport, and a significant undisclosed amount of cash she kept on hand. The official narrative, the one the police were leaning into with the comfortable certainty of those who see a pattern they recognize, was one of a voluntary disappearance. They saw a spoiled, restless heiress chafing under the weight of expectation and privilege, staging a dramatic exit from a life she found suffocating, a rich girl running away from daddy's rules. But the man sitting across from us, his hands trembling slightly despite his efforts to still them, believed this tidy explanation was a catastrophic error. He had come to us because he knew, in the way only a parent can, that the story was far more sinister, and that every second the police spent looking the wrong way was a second his daughter spent in unimaginable danger. "But you don't think so," Daniel stated. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection, a statement of pure, unvarnished fact. It wasn't a question, not really. It was an assessment, a cold reading of the anguish and defiance that radiated from the man sitting across from him. He had heard the official line, and he had immediately discarded it, his instincts already picking at the threads of the too neat, too convenient narrative. Elara Finch-Vaughn seemed to crumple slightly at the directness, then just as quickly stiffen his spine, the last vestiges of his aristocratic pride rallying to his daughter's defense. "The police," he said, his voice so tight it threatened to snap, "see a pattern they recognize. They see a portfolio of past cases, a statistical probability. They see a privileged young woman with the means and the motive to stage a dramatic exit from a life of pressure." He leaned forward, his well-manicured hands gripping the edge of the formica table as if it were the only solid thing left in his universe. His eyes, glistening with a sheen of unshed tears, locked onto Daniel's. "But I see my daughter. I changed her diapers. I held her when she skinned her knees. I saw the light in her eyes when she talked about Caravaggio's use of light and shadow. She was troubled, yes, wrestling with demons I perhaps failed to see. But she would not do this. Not like this." He drew a ragged breath, and when he spoke again, his words were softer yet carried the weight of absolute, unshakable truth. "She left her dog, a little ridiculous French bulldog named Baguette. She adored that creature. She was his entire world and he was hers. She would never, ever, not if she were planning a trip around the corner, let alone fleeing the country, she would never abandon her dog alone in that apartment. It is an absolute impossibility. It was the same kind of simple, devastating human proof that always pierced through the noise and found its mark with us. It was the key that unlocked our commitment. It wasn't about forensics or forced entry. It was about the fundamental, unchangeable essence of a person, the orchid that needed watering on Tuesdays, the ferns that were a testament to a nurturing spirit, the dog. These were the anchors of a soul, the things that defined a life far more accurately than any bank statement or passport. To ignore that was to misunderstand the entire case. Daniel gave a single sharp nod. He took the case. The retainer the man offered was substantial enough to cover our expenses for 6 months, a figure that would have made most men blink. But I saw the glint in Daniel's eye, and I knew it had nothing to do with the money. The money was just a tool, a means to an end. The spark in his gaze was the spark of the hunt, the ignition of his formidable intellect. It was the allure of the puzzle. A story that on the surface made perfect logical sense, but which contained a single faint off-key note that only he seemed to hear. It was the dissonance in the father's story, the silent scream of a neglected dog in an empty apartment, that had hooked him. He wasn't just looking for a missing heiress. He was already listening for the echo of the lie that had made her disappear. The machinery of our investigation shuddered into motion. its gears engaging along two distinctly separate but ultimately connected tracks. Daniel vanished into the city's damp, indifferent embrace, a spectre moving through the rain-slicked streets. His destination was the underbelly of Elara's new world. He was tracking down her elusive new friends, a shifting, enigmatic collection of radical artists, fervent activists, and opportunistic hangers-on who all seemed to orbit a gritty downtown gallery known as the Rabbit Hole. It was a place, he muttered before leaving, where ideas were more dangerous than weapons and pretension was the primary currency. His world was one of whispered conversations in alleyways, of reading truth in averted gazes and nervous tics, of applying pressure to the fragile seams of a subculture that prided itself on its secrecy. Meanwhile, my world contracted to the cool blue glow of my laptop screen, a universe of digits and data trails. I dove headlong into the pristine, ordered chaos of Elara Finch-Vaughn's finances, a digital footprint of a life lived in two worlds, one of staggering privilege and one of something else. Bank statements, credit card reports, investment portfolios, I spread them across the Formica table like a surgeon preparing his instruments, seeking the malignant cell hidden among the healthy ones. And that is precisely where Sarah Sanderson found her entry point into the investigation and into our fractured partnership. She had been observing from her side of the booth, her intelligent eyes missing nothing. As I meticulously arranged the documents, she leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through my concentration. It was quiet, yet it carried a firmness, a resolve that had been tempered in the fire of her own ordeal. "Let me help," she said. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of capability. I hesitated, my instinct to protect this fragile, recovering woman warring with the practical need for another set of eyes. I looked up, my expression undoubtedly skeptical. She met my gaze without flinching. "I'm good with details," she continued, a hint of steel beneath the softness. "I spent years looking for inconsistencies in medical charts, for the one aberrant lab value, the slight irregularity in a heartbeat rhythm that everyone else overlooks. A pattern of numbers. It's not so different. It's all a language. And I'm a quick study." The decision was taken out of my hands. Daniel, shrugging on his worn leather coat, had paused to listen. His eyes flicked from her determined face to my uncertain one. He didn't offer a long speech or a debate. He simply gave a single, brief, decisive nod in my direction, a silent transfer of trust. "Show her," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. And then, with a final glance that seemed to hold a silent message for Sarah, a look of acknowledgement of something more, he turned and was gone, the door sighing shut behind him, leaving the two of us surrounded by the financial anatomy of a missing girl. The air in the booth changed. It was no longer just Michael and a client. It was Michael and Sarah, and a stack of papers that held the key to a life. A new dynamic was born in that moment, a trio now fully formed, each of us playing a crucial part in untangling the mystery. So I did. I pushed a stack of statements toward her, my initial skepticism giving way to a cautious curiosity. What followed was not merely helpful, it was a masterclass in observational analysis. Sarah Sanderson was, in a word, brilliant. Her approach was not that of an accountant nor a detective, but of a diagnostician. Her nurse's eye for subtle anomalies, honed in the high-stakes environment of a hospital, where a single misread decimal point or a slight change in a vital sign could mean life or death, proved to be the perfect, unexpected complement to my own methodical number crunching. Where I saw columns of data, she saw a patient's chart. Where I looked for discrepancies in sums, she looked for arrhythmias in spending patterns. She didn't try to grasp the entire financial landscape at once. Instead, she focused with a laser-like precision on the micro, believing the macro truth was hidden in the smallest, most mundane details. Her finger tracing down a digital column of transactions suddenly stopped. She had isolated a series of small recurring charges, I had initially dismissed as insignificant. Modest, weekly donations to an obscure environmental advocacy group registered as the Verdant Shield. To my algorithmic mind, they were noise, a rounding error in the vast ledger of a trust fund, but Sarah saw a story. "It's not the amount," she said, her voice calm but intent, her fingertip tapping the screen with a soft click to emphasize her point. "Look, it's the timing. The rhythm. Every Tuesday like a metronome. 9:05 a.m., almost without variance. It was a ritual. A line item in her weekly routine as predictable as brushing her teeth." She then scrolled down, her brow furrowing. "But now look here, the last 2 payments. They're early. One on a Monday morning, the next on a Sunday evening. And this is the real key," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They didn't come from her primary checking account, the one that funded this Tuesday ritual. They were pulled from a different, much smaller savings account. It's like a habit she was incredibly meticulous about, a part of her identity. Then suddenly, it became frantic, urgent, it broke its own pattern. This wasn't a donation anymore. It was a payment made under duress. The rhythm is wrong. The heartbeat is off." In that moment, the dusty, dry financial records transformed into a living, breathing narrative. She wasn't just reading numbers. She was reading a person's state of mind. She had uncovered the first faint crack in the facade, the initial symptom of an illness Elara had tried to hide. That regular Tuesday donation was no longer a charitable impulse. It was a leash. And the change in pattern suggested the leash had been jerked hard. Sarah hadn't just found a clue. She had diagnosed the patient from 1,000 miles away, using only the faint digital pulse of her bank account. The quiet nurse in the booth had just become our most valuable profiler. It was a thread, slender but strong, and we began to pull on it with meticulous care. While Daniel was immersed in the sensory overload of the rabbit hole, navigating its bohemian chaos, deciphering the cryptic slang of its patrons, and trying to smell the truth beneath the layers of incense, acrylic paint, and youthful pretension, we remained anchored in the sterile, ordered silence of our booth, untangling a very different kind of snarl, a financial one. The two worlds could not have been more different, yet they were inextricably linked, and we were the translators between them. The most fascinating element, however, was the palpable energy that connected these two separate investigations. The live wire of romantic tension that hummed between Daniel and Sarah, a current so potent it seemed to arc across the city even in their physical absence. Their partnership was evolving in real time, forged not over dinner dates but over evidence and whispered deductions. He would call in for an update, his voice typically a flat, weary monotone reserved for the transactional exchange of facts. But the moment I began to relay a finding, specifically one credited to Sarah, a subtle but undeniable shift would occur. A slight warmth would bleed into his tone, a layer of focused interest that was never there for my solo discoveries. "Put her on," he'd say, the command simple and direct, yet carrying an unspoken weight of respect and a desire to hear her voice, to engage her mind directly. I would pass my phone to Sarah, and she would take it, her expression transforming into one of intense, professional concentration. She'd listen to his descriptions of the gallery's gritty interior, the attitudes of the people he was questioning, the atmosphere of defiant idealism masking something darker, and then, connecting his on-the-ground observations to the digital paper trail in front of her, she would offer a quiet, brilliantly insightful observation that would bridge the gap between our worlds. The conversations he's hearing about direct action and radical change. Ask him if the people having them are wearing a specific type of boot, she might say, her finger resting on a line item on her screen. I'm looking at a vendor charge from 3 weeks ago, not from the Verdant Shield, but from a separate personal account. It's for tactical footwear, outdoor supply store. It's a single large purchase. Why would an art student need tactical gear, unless she wasn't just talking about change? The silence on the other end of the line would then stretch for a beat too long. A profound, silent acknowledgement of a stellar catch. In that pause, you could almost hear his mind recalibrating, fitting this new piece of the puzzle into place with a soft, satisfying click. They were no longer just a detective and a victim. They were partners, speaking a new unspoken language built on mutual intuition and a shared grim determination. They were building the case together, brick by evidentiary brick, and with every shared discovery, every moment of silent intellectual synergy, their connection deepened, weaving a bond that was as formidable as it was unstated. The investigation was the crucible, and within its heat, something powerful and new was being formed. Daniel's side of the investigation was a journey into a world of deliberate shadows and cultivated ambiguity. While Sarah and I deciphered the clean digital trails of finance, he was mired in the gritty human reality of Elara's new life. Her boyfriend, Kyle, was a study in contradictions, a sculptor whose raw magnetic charisma in the gallery was underpinned by an intensely private, almost paranoid defensiveness when questioned. He was evasive not with lies, but with artistic obfuscation, answering direct questions with philosophical ramblings about the performance of identity and the constraints of material existence. He was a man who treated a simple conversation like a piece of clay, to be shaped and distorted. The owner of the Rabbit Hole Gallery was even less helpful, a sullen, nervous man who was a closed book, his arms permanently crossed over a chest that seemed to be protecting more than just his own heart. He viewed Daniel not as a seeker of truth, but as a contaminant, a bringer of bad publicity that could shatter the fragile ecosystem of his avant-garde enterprise. The clues Daniel painstakingly gathered did seem to coalesce into a coherent if disheartening narrative. It pointed toward a staged disappearance, a close friend from the gallery, a woman with neon green hair and eyes full of a performative world-weariness, mentioned that Elara had recently been talking about starting over, about burning the canvas of her old life to create something entirely new and authentic. She spoke of wanting to disappear from the gilded cage of her family's world. It was a story that fit a neat, psychologically understandable, if profoundly sad picture. The troubled heiress orchestrating her own liberation, leaving the cold gilded prison of her inheritance for a life of bohemian freedom. Then the first body turned up. The discovery was a violent screeching halt to that comfortable theory. It wasn't Elara. It was Maya, one of the young women from the gallery's inner circle, a talented ceramicist known for her fierce loyalty and infectious laugh. She was found discarded like trash in a reeking dumpster in the alley behind the rabbit hole, a place she had considered a second home. But the scene was not one of a heated argument or a reckless struggle. The cause of death was a single, precise, and devastatingly professional stab wound, delivered upward under the sternum, piercing the heart with an efficiency that spoke of anatomical knowledge and cold, dispassionate practice. It was a signature kill. Nothing like the messy, emotional crime of passion the responding officers had initially and lazily assumed. In that single, brutal moment, the entire picture we had been carefully assembling shattered into 1,000 irreconcilable shards. The comfortable narrative of a voluntary vanishing evaporated, replaced by a chilling, terrifying truth. This wasn't a story about a runaway heiress seeking freedom. This was the work of a predator. A hunter was moving through Elara's world, and they were not just searching for her. They were ruthlessly, methodically silencing anyone who might have known too much, closing off every possible leak with clinical, murderous precision. The case had just escalated from a missing person to a blood-soaked conspiracy. The city's grim rhythm of tragedy seemed to be accelerating, each beat a darker, more violent note than the last. The second death struck closer to the heart of the mystery. confirming our darkest suspicions with brutal finality. It was Cale, the enigmatic sculptor, Elara's charismatic and evasive boyfriend. He was discovered in his vast industrial loft, a space that had once been a cathedral to his artistic angst, now transformed into a chaotic crime scene. The place had been violently ransacked, not with the frantic energy of a common burglary, but with a systematic, terrifying thoroughness. Canvases were slashed, not for the art, but to search behind them. Clay sculptures were shattered into dust, their hollow cores inspected. Drawers were upended, their contents spilled and scattered like confetti at a wedding. The perpetrators had staged the scene with a cynical, calculated eye, sprinkling a negligible amount of low-grade narcotics and overturning a table to suggest a drug deal that had erupted into fatal violence. It was a narrative designed for quick, dismissive closure by an overworked police force. But Daniel Dillon was not looking for a narrative. He was looking for truth. He returned to our booth at Mel's, carrying the aura of the crime scene with him like a second skin. The damp chill of the rain clinging to his coat mingled with a faint metallic scent, the unmistakable olfactory ghost of death and spilled blood. His expression was a mask of grim fury, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle working beneath the skin. He slid into the booth, his movement stiff with contained anger. "It was a sham," he growled, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to emanate from a place of deep, personal offense at the clumsiness of the lie. The drugs were props. The chaos was arranged. Someone wasn't just trying to kill him. They were looking for something. They turned that entire place inside out. This was an interrogation that ended in an execution. His eyes, dark and stormy, didn't scan the room or look to me for input. They went immediately and instinctively to Sarah's, performing a silent, urgent check-in. It was a glance that sought not information, but confirmation of her safety. A primal need to ensure this spreading darkness had not touched her. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Her own eyes, which had once held the softness of her previous life, now reflected a determined empathy, a strength forged in her own recent furnace of fear. She understood the weight he carried, the horror he had just witnessed. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, she gave a small, steady, and profoundly reassuring nod. It was a gesture that said, "I am here. I am steady. I see you." The look they shared in that crowded diner was so electrically intimate, so densely charged with unspoken concern and a burgeoning powerful connection, that I felt a sharp pang of being an intruder on a private moment. The air between them crackled with a language that had no need for words, a silent dialogue of shared resilience and unacknowledged care that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. I had to consciously look away, focusing intently on the cold dregs of my coffee, granting them the privacy their silent conversation demanded. The discovery of Kyle's body wasn't just another data point. It was the key that unlocked the horrifying architecture of the entire case. The staged disappearance we had been investigating was revealed for what it truly was, merely the first act in a much larger, more sinister production. Elara hadn't simply run away from a life of privilege. She had inadvertently stumbled into a viper's nest of something far more dangerous than artistic rebellion. She had glimpsed the true nature of the operation she was funding, whether it was the eco-terrorist cell masquerading as the verdant shield or a different kind of beast entirely, and that knowledge had made her a mortal threat. Her vanishing wasn't a flight to freedom. It was the abduction designed to look like one. And now the second act was underway, liquidation. Someone, some cold and efficient organization, was tying up loose ends with ruthless, brutal efficiency. They were cleaning house, eliminating anyone who could connect them to Elara or expose their true purpose. Maya for knowing too much of the gossip, Kyle for likely being a confidant, or perhaps for whatever he himself had been hiding. They were erasing the entire circle, methodically and permanently. The predator we were hunting wasn't a single individual, it was a system, a machine with a terrifying aptitude for silence. They had planned Elara's disappearance with precision, and they were now executing the cleanup with the same cold professionalism. We were no longer just searching for a missing girl. We were racing against a clock that was ticking down the seconds until every witness, every potential lead, was permanently silenced, and Elara Finch-Vaughn herself became just another tragic, unsolvable statistic. The stakes had been raised from a family's tragedy to a full-blown conspiracy, and the shadow it cast was growing longer and darker by the hour. The name hung in the air between us, no longer just a line item on a bank statement, but a malignant entity given form, the verdant shield. Those meticulously timed donations, which Sarah had so brilliantly discerned, were not acts of charity, but a systematic, rhythmic extraction of funds, now became our only lifeline in a case that was rapidly sinking into a quagmire of violence and lies. It was the single thread we had to pull, and we pulled with everything we had. Terrified it would snap, but knowing it was our only way forward, we dove back into the digital morass, but now with a terrifying new focus. Sarah's discovery was the key that unlocked a hidden door. We began a frantic, deep cross-referencing operation, layering the charity's financial records with every other transaction we could link to Elara and her circle. The vendor charge for tactical footwear, which had once seemed like an odd outlier, now glowed with sinister significance. It wasn't an isolated purchase, it was part of a pattern. We found other charges, buried and obfuscated. Encrypted satellite phone subscriptions purchased through a shell corporation, bulk orders of specialized lithium batteries used for long-range surveillance equipment, and invoices for private cybersecurity services that were far too advanced for any legitimate non-profit. Each piece of data was a brushstroke, and the picture that emerged was not of a group of idealistic environmentalists. This was a front, and a sophisticated one at that. The entity hiding behind the green eco-friendly logo of the verdant shield was not an activist cell. It was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Our best guess, pieced together from the terrifying mosaic of their expenditures, was a highly specialized for-hire operation specializing in corporate espionage and targeted assassination. They weren't trying to save the rainforest. They were being paid to sabotage a rival mining operation within it. They weren't protesting polluters. They were eliminating key executives who refused to be bought out. Their environmental mission was the perfect cover. It provided a righteous narrative, attracted useful idealistic pawns like Elara, and allowed them to move through the world with a built-in justification for secrecy and paranoia. Elara, in her passionate rebellious phase, had been their perfect mark. She had the money, the desire to rebel against her family's corporate world, and the moral fervor to believe she was funding a noble cause. She had been funneling them a steady, significant stream of capital, unknowingly bankrolling operations that were the very antithesis of everything she thought she believed in. But Elara was not a fool. She was an art history student, trained to look beneath the surface, to see the layers of meaning and deception in a masterpiece. She must have seen a crack in their facade, an offhand comment, a piece of equipment that didn't fit the narrative, a target that didn't make environmental sense. She had pieced it together, realizing the monstrous truth. She was not a benefactor. She was a financier of murder. She had tried to pull out, to cut the funding, and in a moment of terrified clarity, she had likely threatened to go to her father to expose the whole operation. That was the moment she signed her own death warrant. They couldn't let a Finch-Vaughn unleash that kind of scandal, so they didn't kill her. They took her. She was too valuable an asset to simply discard. She was leverage, a key to her family's empire, and a hostage to ensure their silence. And now we knew where they were holding her. Our digital excavation, a frantic night of following property deeds, utility records, and shell company ownership trails, led us to a location, an abandoned textile mill on the rotting industrial edge of the city, a hulking relic of a bygone era. The charity had purchased it 6 months ago under a layers-deep false name, a transaction designed to withstand casual scrutiny, but not the forensic audit we were now performing. The power draw from the city grid was minimal, just enough to run basic lighting and, crucially, their formidable security system, which, according to the schematics we acquired, was a state-of-the-art military-grade setup. Motion sensors, thermal cameras, encrypted frequency jammers. This wasn't to keep vandals out. This was a fortress designed to make a person disappear without a trace. It was the perfect hideout, a decaying, forgotten shell protecting a sophisticated, brutal core. We were no longer theorists. We were tacticians. We had a target, and we knew that inside that grim, silent fortress, a young woman was alive but running out of time. The next move was ours, and it would have to be perfect. The decision was made not in words, but in a series of silent, irrevocable actions. There was no debate, no discussion of calling in the authorities who had already failed to see the truth. The three of us simply moved. We became a unit, a trinity of disparate skills bound by a shared grim purpose, and we went into the belly of the beast. Daniel took point, as he always did, transforming instantly from a man sipping coffee in a diner into a weapon of focused intent. He was a shadow with purpose, his movements fluid and silent, his entire being concentrated on the environment ahead, reading the darkness for threats, his instincts a more reliable guide than any map. He was our shield, our scout, the sharpened tip of our spear. I followed in his wake, my own role clearly defined. In my arms I carried my laptop, its case slung over my shoulder, but it was more than a machine. It was a digital skeleton key. It was my weapon, my lockpick, my window into the electronic soul of this place. My job was to interface with the darkness, to find the vulnerabilities in their high-tech armor, to blind their eyes and deafen their ears while Daniel moved through the spaces I created. I was the architect of their ignorance, the creator of blind spots. And then there was Sarah. She positioned herself right behind me, a determined presence where there had once only been empty space. Her face was pale, drained of color by a fear that was entirely rational and justified, but it was set into lines of unwavering resolve. In her hand, she clutched not a gun but a small can of pepper spray, its presence a testament to her reality. She wasn't a fighter. She was a healer. She had no training for this, yet she had absolutely refused to be left behind, to wait safely in the car as a passive victim. That chapter of her life was closed. Her insistence was not born of recklessness, but of a profound need to be an active participant in her own redemption, to confront the kind of darkness that had once consumed her. She was part of this now, not as a client or a bystander, but as integral to the team's conscience and purpose as Daniel was to its action, and I was to its information. She was our moral compass, the reminder of what we were fighting for, not just to solve a puzzle, but to save a life. Her very presence, the soft sound of her breath in the eerie quiet, was a powerful assertion that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. Together, the three of us, the hunter, the hacker, and the heart, stepped into the unknown, each of us essential, each of us irrevocably changed. Our ascent through the derelict mill was a tense, silent ballet of controlled movement and held breath, each creak of the old iron stairs sounding like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. Finally, we reached the top floor, a space that had been gutted and remade into something cold and efficient, a stark contrast to the decaying industrial shell that contained it. We found her not in a dungeon cell, but in a stark modern office that felt surgically implanted into the rotting building. The room was almost barren, containing only a steel desk, a single chair, and a bank of monitors showing feeds from the security cameras we had so carefully bypassed. Elara Finch-Vaughn was seated in the chair, her posture rigid with a fear so potent it was a presence in the room. She wasn't tied up with ropes. Her prison was far more psychological. She was trapped by the unwavering gaze of the man standing guard over her. A figure with the cold, dead eyes of a shark and the casual, professional posture of someone for whom violence was a simple tool of the trade. The pistol holstered at his hip wasn't waved about theatrically. It was simply there, an unspoken absolute fact of the situation, a final argument that required no elaboration. She was visibly terrified, her eyes wide and darting, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. But she was, miraculously, physically unharmed. There were no bruises on her arms, no marks on her face. This detail was more telling than any injury. It confirmed our darkest theory about her value. She wasn't a prisoner to be punished. She was a prized asset, a vital component in a larger, more sinister machine. She was the golden key to the entire Finch-Vaughn empire, a living, breathing skeleton key to their fortune, their corporate secrets, and their global influence. Her captors hadn't just wanted her money, they wanted her identity, her access, her very name as a tool for their operations. They had been patient, methodically draining her accounts and studying her patterns, but they weren't done using her. The real exploitation, the deep and irrevocable theft of her family's legacy, was still on the horizon. She was being broken not with violence, but with isolation and dread, being prepared for a role she was meant to play under duress, a puppet CEO, a compliant voice to authorize catastrophic deals, a beautiful, tragic figurehead to front a monstrous fraud. Her well-being was paramount, because a bruised heiress raises questions, a seemingly cooperative one does not. The man with the cold eyes wasn't just a guard, he was a curator of a priceless and unwilling commodity, ensuring she remained in pristine condition until her value could be fully liquidated. We had arrived not at the end of her ordeal, but in the tense, quiet middle of it, and rescuing her meant dismantling a scheme that went far beyond a simple kidnapping. What happened next was a sudden, violent detonation of action in the tense, silent room, a blur of motion so swift and decisive it seemed to warp time itself. One moment, there was a standoff, a fragile equilibrium of fear and threat held in the guard's cold, confident gaze. The next, that equilibrium was utterly annihilated. Daniel didn't telegraph his move with a shout or a shift in posture. He simply uncoiled. His body became an instrument of pure, terrifying efficiency, a symphony of controlled violence played in a fraction of a second. He closed the distance between himself and the guard not with a lunge, but with a fluid, almost graceful step that put him inside the man's reach. His left hand shot out, not toward the weapon, but to control the weapon's arm, immobilizing it with a precise, brutal grip on the wrist that elicited a sharp, involuntary gasp of pain. Simultaneously, his right drove forward in a short, piston-like blow that struck not the jaw but the side of the neck, a targeted strike to the vagus nerve that short-circuited the man's nervous system. The guard's eyes, once so cold and assured, rolled back in their sockets and his knees buckled without a sound. There was no heroic struggle, no exchange of blows. There was only a master demonstrating his brutal craft on an apprentice. The entire disarming was a lesson in anatomical leverage and psychological shock, executed with a chilling absence of hesitation. It was the violence of absolute certainty, while Daniel was a storm of subduing motion, efficiently securing the now incapacitated guard with zip ties pulled from his pocket. A completely different kind of energy entered the space. Sarah moved, but not toward the conflict. She moved toward the victim. She rushed to Elara's side, her own fear sublimated into a profound, focused professionalism. In that moment, she shed the identity of an investigator or a survivor. She reverted to her core essence, a caregiver. She didn't grab the young woman or shout reassurances. She approached her slowly, her hands held open and non-threateningly, and she began to speak to her in low, measured and calming tones. Her voice was a steady anchor in the raging sea of adrenaline and terror. "It's all right. You're safe now. My name is Sarah. I'm a nurse. Can you look at me? Just look at me." Her words were simple, but their effect was immediate and profound. As her voice provided an auditory lifeline, her hands, with a trained professional gentleness, began a swift but thorough assessment, checking Elara's pulse at her wrist, looking into her pupils, running her hands lightly over her arms and shoulders, not to search, but to soothe and to silently confirm she was whole. This tactile reassurance, this human touch devoid of threat, seemed to penetrate the heiress's paralyzing fear more deeply than any promise of safety could. She was being treated not as a piece of evidence, but as a human being in trauma. Under Sarah's ministrations, the terrified, ragged gasps that had been tearing from Elara's throat began to slow, and the wild animal panic in her eyes receded, replaced by a dazed but growing trust. In the aftermath of violence, Sarah had brought the first fragile peace. The aftermath was a chaotic symphony of sirens, flashing lights, and the low, serious murmur of official voices. The police, who had initially been so skeptical, now moved through the grim textile mill with a new grim respect. Their earlier theory of a runaway heiress lying in ashes alongside the evidence of a sophisticated kidnapping and corporate espionage ring. We watched from the periphery as a stunned, ashen-faced Elara Finch-Vaughn was led into the building, his aristocratic composure utterly shattered. The moment he was reunited with his daughter was not one for public viewing. It happened in the back of a waiting ambulance, a private, raw scene of a father's tears washing away the terrible fear that had gripped him. He held Elara as if she were made of glass, his entire world recently fractured and now miraculously made whole again. We had given him that. We had pulled his daughter back from the brink of becoming a permanent ghost in her own life, a puppet for a monstrous scheme. Once the statements were given and the scene was relinquished to the authorities, the three of us found ourselves standing together in the steady, cooling rain outside the mill. The industrial landscape around us was a tableau of neglect and decay, the water dripping from rusted girders and pooling in the cracked asphalt. The air was clean here, washing away the lingering scent of fear and violence that had clung to us inside. We stood in a loose triangle, not speaking, each of us processing the night's events in our own way. The immediate storm of the rescue had passed, the adrenaline receding like a tide, and leaving behind a profound, weary stillness. But the quiet was deceptive. As I looked at Daniel and Sarah, standing there in the dim, hazy light of the street lamps, the rain plastering their hair to their foreheads, I felt the familiar, unsettling certainty settle in my bones. The storm we had just endured, the terror, the violence, the narrow victory, was merely a single squall line. It was not the end of the season. The true tempest was still gathering its strength elsewhere, its center yet unknown. The verdant shield was not a lone entity. It was a tentacle of a much larger, darker organism. They had been humiliated, their operation disrupted, their assets stolen back. An organization that dealt in assassination and corporate annihilation would not simply accept this loss. They would recalibrate. They would seek retribution. And they would continue their work, perhaps under a new name, a new logo, but with the same ruthless purpose. The victory we had won tonight was real, but it was also a declaration of war. We had not found closure. We had made powerful, invisible enemies, and as the rain fell around us, it felt less like a cleansing and more like a baptism into a deeper, more dangerous level of the fight we had chosen, a fight that was only just beginning. The downpour continued its soft, relentless percussion on the crumbling asphalt and corrugated steel roofs of the industrial district, wrapping the three of us in a private, shimmering world, within the chaos of the official response. Amidst the swirling red and blue lights, the shouted orders, and the low hum of generators, a smaller, more intimate drama was unfolding. Daniel stood close to Sarah, the space between them charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the recent violence and everything to do with a profound, unspoken connection. He didn't touch her, but his entire posture was a silent declaration. He was angled toward her, his broad shoulders positioned as if to physically intercept any threat, whether it was a sudden gust of wind, a stray glance from a passing officer, or the lingering psychic shock of the ordeal. He was her human shield against the entire world, a bastion of solid, unwavering presence in the unsettling aftermath. A single drop of rain, caught in the dark strands of her hair, broke free and began a slow, deliberate journey down her temple, tracing a path over the delicate skin near her eye. Daniel's hand, hanging at his side, gave a barely perceptible twitch, his fingers curling inward for a fraction of a second, as if electrocuted by a primal instinct to reach out, to gently wipe the droplet away, to offer a comfort that was as much for himself as for her. But he held the impulse back, the gesture dying before it was born, a testament to the formidable control he wielded over his own emotions. The words, when they finally came, were not meant for anyone else. "You did good in there," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was almost swallowed by the rain, a sound meant for her ears alone. It was more than praise. It was an acknowledgment of her metamorphosis, a recognition of the steel she had discovered within herself in that stark office. It was the validation of a partner to an equal. Her response was a soft exhalation, a whisper that carried a depth of feeling that belied its volume. "So did you," she breathed back. Her words were simple, but they held a universe of meaning, gratitude for his protection, awe at his capability, and an acknowledgement of the dark, necessary violence he had wielded on her behalf, a violence she accepted as part of the man he was. The look that passed between them then was a conversation in itself, a silent, potent exchange that lasted only a heartbeat, but felt like an eternity. It was filled with everything their cautious, wounded hearts would not allow them to give voice to. There was fear, not of the past, but of the frightening, unknown future this connection promised. There was a deep, hard-won respect forged in the crucible of shared danger, and underpinning it all was a raw, undeniable magnetic attraction that hung, thick and electric, in the damp air between them, a force as real and as powerful as the storm around them. Then, as if breaking a spell that threatened to consume them both, Daniel turned his head toward me. The vulnerability in his eyes was shuttered away, replaced by the familiar, grim resolve. His voice, when he spoke, was once again the flat, commanding tone of our partnership. "Let's go." The two words were a dismissal of the moment, a return to the reality of our world. But as I fell into step behind them, watching him unconsciously adjust his stride to match hers, I knew the moment had changed something fundamental. The storm within was just beginning to brew. The walk back to the car was a silent procession through the weeping city, a somber march under a sky that refused to clear. We moved as a unit, a trio bound not by choice but by the grim shared currency of trauma and resolve. The rain fell around us, a gentle, persistent veil that isolated us from the sleeping world, turning the distant streetlights into hazy, golden orbs. Daniel led the way, his shoulders set against the weather and the weight of the violence he had just enacted, a reluctant detective whose soul was forever tethered to the darkness he fought. He moved with a predator's grace even in retreat, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows, a permanent sentry against a threat only he could fully see. I followed the numbers man, my mind already trying to compartmentalize the night's horrors into data points, to find the cold, clean logic in the chaos, seeking solace in the patterns that always eventually emerged from the madness. And then there was Sarah walking between us, a nurse who had been forced to learn a new terrible kind of medicine, the diagnosis of human evil. She had learned to see the monsters not in the shadows of a hospital room, but hiding in the plain sight of everyday life, masked by respectability and armed with a cruelty more precise than any disease. In that quiet, waterlogged walk, the team solidified, its final member irrevocably found. She was not a consultant, not a client, but a fundamental pillar. She brought a perspective we desperately lacked, an understanding of the human heart under duress, a healer's instinct for the source of the wound, and a courage that was not bred in violence, but discovered in the aftermath of it. We were no longer two and a guest. We were three. Our trinity of damaged complementary skills. And as the car came into view, a dark shape in the mist, the overwhelming truth of our situation settled upon me with the weight of the water soaking through my coat. The world, it seemed, held an endless rolling supply of storms for us to face. This rescue was not an end. It was merely a single hard-won battle in a war without borders or a visible enemy. For every Elara we pulled back from the brink, there were a dozen others being swallowed by the chaos. For every verdant shield we exposed, another would fester in the rotten foundations of some other seemingly legitimate enterprise. The darkness was not a singular entity to be defeated. It was a hydra, and we had just drawn its attention. We were walking away from one storm, yes, but we were walking directly into the gathering winds of the next. The car wasn't a getaway vehicle. It was a transport to the next front line, and as Daniel opened the door for Sarah, a gesture of unexpected, unconscious chivalry, I knew that our strange, fractured family was now complete, and our purpose was clearer and more terrifying than ever.